So today we're going to be reading an article from the New European about how extremism went mainstream in UK politics by author Paul Stoker. And again, his argument I think is quite a good and valid one, to be honest. So he begins. A prominent British politician addressing a far-right rally in Germany may have, in simpler times, reflected an act of political suicide, not in Brexit Britain. In the final weeks of the country's election campaign, Nigel Farage addressed to the Nationalist Alternative for Germany party saw him lambast the leaders of Germany's two largest parties, describing the Social Democrat challenger Martin Schulz as a fanatic and calling rival and ultimate victor Angela Merkel's decision to provide shelter to refugees fleeing war and desperation the worst decision by any leader in modern political history. It was very do as I say, not as I do, from the man who described the culture Barack Obama's intervention in the EU referendum as disgraceful. There was a notable lack of outrage in Britain, as Farage, addressing a group whose chairwoman at the time had suggested that German border police should shoot refugees, and whose Hungarian regional leader called for Germany to stop beating itself up about Nazi crimes during the Second World War, describing Berlin's Holocaust Memorial as a monument of shame. It's a searing indictment of a country where far-right ideas aren't just tolerated as an ugly consequence of liberal democracy, but have become normalised part of the national debate. And I agree. They have become normalised. In fact, I just did a video about that. Similarly, it is reflected of the historic failure of politicians to confront intolerant xenophobic ideas since the turn of the 21st century, which facilitated the rise of nationalism on our shores and ultimately the Brexit vote. However, how have the far right and their ideas, which stigmatise immigrants as disease-ridden scourges or refugees, are as grave a threat as to British identity, been allowed to enter the mainstream? It is important to note that xenophobic ideas have always been present in British political culture over the centuries. Migrants from Ireland escaping famine in the mid-19th century were met with hostility and at times violence. Jews escaping persecution in the Russian Empire who arrived in Britain at the turn of the 20th century were met with similarly callous reception. Extreme anti-immigrant political movements such as the British Brothers League were formed as a response to Jewish immigration and pressured the government to tighten immigration controls. Where have we seen that before? EDL, anyone? Football Lads Alliance, anyone? You know, it's just, change Jew to, Muslim, and, 20th century to, 21st century, and, it's a deadly parallel you've got there. The fascist and right-wing extremist movements, which menaced between the First and Second World Wars, similarly attacked migrants, mostly Jews, verbally and physically. While these were marginally organisations, many of the prejudices towards foreigners were held by the wider public. Yet ever since the genocidal crimes of the Nazism during the Second World War were revealed, far-right politics and xenophobia remained, at least in Britain, on the fringes, as discredited and taboo movements. It was a collection of eccentric traditionalist conspiracy theorists and Hitler worshippers. Mainstream politicians like Enoch Powell, who fled into their narrative that white Britain was being besieged by coloured immigrants, were banished to the wilderness by the elites. The politics of nationalism ultimately stank of exactly what Britain had fought against at great cost during the Second World War, still fresh in the minds of those who had been there. Yet something changed at the turn of the 21st century, particularly following the election of New Labour. There was a distinct opposition to a party who promised to usher in a new era of tolerance and a Britain at ease with itself in a multicultural nation. Many white Britons were simply not as relaxed about it. The right-wing press began to pump out anti-immigration scare stories on an industrial scale. Politicians on the right began to use immigration as a stick to beat the other party with, ending a decades-old consensus which left immigration and racial issues off the table. Opposition leader William Hague, egged on by hard-right journalists and colleagues and advisors, claimed in a 2001 speech, "Talk about asylum and they call you a racist. Talk about your nation and they call you Little Englanders. This government thinks Britain would be all right if we only had a different people." Indignation was directed at Hague from Liberals and the left, yet they were sometimes complicit. Labour Home Secretary David Blunkett would later claim later that year that asylum seekers were swamping Britain's schools. Despite Britain enjoying an extended period of economic growth under the Tory Blair and Brown stewardship, the world was beginning to seem more dangerous and an unstable place. First 9/11, then 7/7. Installed within Britons an anxiety over foreign terrorist attacks. Eventually they be asylum seekers, economic migrants, or British citizens. The enlargement of the European Union, which enabled migrants from beyond the former Iron Curtain to travel to Britain en masse, increased fears over a thinly spread employment opportunities in larger parts of the country being spread even thinner. Politicians hardly bothered to quell the suspicions that had been increasing number of Britons that they had been losing their country. In fact, they encouraged them. Tory leader Michael Howard, himself of immigrant stock, blew a dog whistle at a straw man when he proclaimed on a 2005 billboard that it is not racist to impose limits on immigration. Gordon Brown similarly pledged British jobs for British workers, a promise that he could hardly keep in a modern economy plugged into an increasingly globalised world. It was of no coincidence of this period that it would also see the unprecedented rise of the far right, whose eyes gleamed at the new era of intolerance. The help of the BNP received from the mainstream media's daily immigration scare stories was not lost on their activists, with one saying, "Newspapers have become obsessed with the asylum issue. I have not been able to believe the Daily Express, issue after issue, day after day, asylum this, asylum that." It's still the same today. So we know we have the luxury of banging on people's doors with the mainstream issue of the day. It has legitimized us. We are now the mainstream. It helped that party from under its under its reformist leader Nick Griffin had finally recognised that Britain's largely anti-fascist voters did not want Hitler apologists or obscure racial theorists, but simple jingoistic solutions to asylum and immigration. They swapped their skinheads for suits and rosettes. The far right rebranded themselves as popularists, fighting against a corrupt elite despite never really moving away from anti-Semitism or sinister plans to deport non-whites, which they could only be discussed behind closed doors. Of course, famously, Nick Griffin was filmed doing that exact thing. Where are we? Yes, their extremism was so lenient, however, not even the vicious right-wing press could stomach them. The extremism was so latent, however, not even the vicious right-wing press could stomach them. Daily Mail columnist Richard Littlejohn, taking a merciful break from his rants against asylum seekers and multiculturalism, claimed that it was nauseating to discover that decent people would even consider voting for this loathsome bunch of psychopaths. Littlejohn and his colleagues in the gutter press, in their desire to turn the floundering Conservative Party into a hard right one, may have well have been generally outraged at the rise of the party whose origins lay in the 1930s fascism. Yet they continued. Yet they helped continue to contribute to a climate in which the far-right ideas could thrive and gain votes for extremists. It soon became obvious, however, that the public were voting for the BNP with their fingers clenched firmly over their noses. They were just shy of 1 million votes for them in 2009. Their support appeared to have peaked, then plummeted following national exposure and infighting, which has bedeviled similar organisations since their inception. Yet, following their collapse, James Forsyth pathetically wrote in the Telegraph, "Someone else, more plausible, with less baggage, will come along and seriously advance the BNP's vile agenda." The collapse of the BNP, the alienation of Conservatives over David Call Me Dave Cameron's fury over the Tories' makeover, as well as the disenfranchisement of traditional Labour voters feeling isolated by the party's cosmopolitan gap, left a hole in the political landscape. A party with less baggage than the BNP and a leader with more charisma than Nick Griffin always stood a chance of making an impact. And just they did. The benefactor of the voters of the disenfranchised blue-collar traditionalist was an odd one. The tweed-jacketed, salmon-trousered alumni of Dunwich College, Nigel Farage and his merry band of UKIPers. The party had learned much from the BNP's populist rebrand, and actively sought extremist voters, party voters. Speaking in 2014, Farage claimed he was proud to have won over a third of BNP voters. They ditched their single-minded approach to Euroscepticism, which dealt almost solely with the question of sovereignty, and they started talking more about identity, multiculturalism, and most importantly, immigration, linking all of Britain's membership, likening all to Britain's membership of the EU. They tapped into a far larger pool of voters than the BNP ever could. An increasingly pessimistic electorate who frowned following the financial crisis had grave doubts that their children and grandchildren could look forward to the same future they had. They were prepared to listen. And you see this countless times throughout history. You want a really good example? You've got to look no further than the end of some of the debates that were recorded at the end of the Roman Senate, of the Roman Empire, where you literally had the Senate discussing immigration. And it's kind of funny because a lot of the arguments they were making back then have almost not changed. Obviously there are some minor differences, but a lot of their arguments they're using haven't really changed. The response from the mainstream politicians to UKIP after they began to reform well in the elections from 2012 panicked. The Conservative Party in particular sought to demonstrate a hawkish approach to immigration and EU issues. A referendum was offered on British membership of the EU. The party sought to demonstrate that they could cut immigration by tens of thousands while still be a member of the EU, by tackling the non-existent health tourism and restricting migrants' access to benefits and draconian visa regulations for non-EU citizens in the 2014 immigration bill. At times, they even made it thoroughly undignified attempts to copy the populist anti-establishment rhetoric of UKIP. Immigration Minister James Brokenshire stated in a 2014 speech, "For too long the benefits of immigration went to employers who wanted an easy supply of cheap labour, or to the wealthy metropolitan elite who wanted cheap tradesmen and services, but not to the ordinary hard-working people of this country." The cumulative impact of the Conservative Party Co-option of UKIP ideas and language was to normalise the politics of xenophobia. When transitional controls were removed in early 2014 on immigration from Romania and Bulgaria, the response was utterly hysterical. Politicians and the media spoke of genuinely possibility of a wave of crime and disease which would follow after being on the receiving end of a particularly rough grilling by radio host James O'Brien. Nigel Farage claimed any normal and fair-minded person would have a perfect right to be concerned if a group of Romanian people suddenly moved in next door. The politics of if you want a well, you can guess what the word is, but if you want an N-word for a neighbour, vote Labour, was back, dressed in the language of respectability. In a matter of weeks after the comments, Farage's party would go on to win the European elections. 2015 would send an already feverish anti-immigration climate into overdrive. The year began with a terror attack at the office of French satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo, which was framed by the right wing across Europe as the inevitable consequence of multiculturalism. The summer would see Europe's refugee crisis come under the spotlight, and many saw it as an opportunity to stoke fears of a continent under invasion. Letting migrants in would alter the cultural balance of the country forever. The Arab and the Muslim world is degenerating into chaos, war and terrorism. The ascendancy of radical Islam is producing untold barbarism. The West-imposed model of the nation-state is collapsing into tribal warfare. A dying culture turned murderously upon itself whilst trying to simultaneously conquer the wider world. Not words taken from out of a National Front pamphlet, but by Maylene Phillips, writing in the centre-right broadsheet The Times. Further terror attacks in Paris in November conflated the question of Islam, multiculturalism and security, all to feature as the EU referendum loomed. The referendum campaign was always likely to be a charged affair, but one should not mistake the anti-immigration tone of the debate as the growing influence of the far right. Centre-right politicians Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, Ian Duncan Smith all pitched in with comments straight out of the far-right playbook. The latter claimed before the campaign had started, saying that staying in the EU made Britain more vulnerable to Paris-style terror attacks. Michael Gove aped the anti-establishment rhetoric of UKIP, which created a mythical battle between a rotten establishment and the ordinary people, by arguing that people have had enough of experts. Boris Johnson referred to the US president as half Kenyan and claimed he had an ancestral dislike of the British Empire. Lurid campaign literature spoke of Turkey's imminent EU membership, which was not imminent. It never has been. Remember, they've been trying to get in for 20 years. It's still not happening anytime soon. And implying that waves of Muslim immigration to Britain. Another pamphlet from the official Leave campaign claimed that if Britain were to stay in the EU, its border would be with Iraq and Syria. Since the narrow Leave vote, Brexiteers have been keen to rewrite the history of Britain's vote to leave the EU as having nothing to do with bigotry or xenophobia. The argument holds that Britain voted to be a more globalist and outward-looking, to reconnect with the Commonwealth countries such as India, Pakistan, Nigeria and Bangladesh, to free ourselves from the humiliating shackles of Brussels, to resume our rightful place in the world. It goes without saying that there is precious little evidence to back this up. Immigration was the most important issue according to the Ipsos Mori guiding vote poll to vote a Leave guiding the vote of most voters a week before to leave. Or Leave voters polled by Lord Ashcroft, more than 3/4 believe that immigration and multiculturalism to be a force for ill. The mainstream of the far right has enabled Brexit has not slowed down since the referendum vote. In her first Tory Conference Party speech as Prime Minister, Theresa May, rather than seeking unity to unify a bitterly divided country, decided to attack a mythical pro-EU establishment, claiming that they find your patriotism distasteful, your concern about immigration's nonsense, and your views about crime illiberal, your attachment to your job security inconvenient. Home Secretary Amber Rudd proposed a raft of anti-immigration measures. The government's insistence on a hard Brexit in order to end freedom of movement, as well as their crackdown on non-EU student visas, suggest one seeking to pull back up the drawbridge despite the claims of merely taking back control. The descent of Britain's political culture from one which learned the lessons of the past and was militant towards the consequences of nationalism has been a rapid one. Worryingly, it shows no signs of showing down as Britain hurls out of the European Union and into the unknown. So, that's Paul. And I agree with him on that, to be honest. There has been, particularly when you look at the political setting, it has just gone from one thing to another. And he's right when you come to talk about the Daily Mail, where they are constantly banging on about, asylum seekers and, immigrants into this country, and will take every opportunity to demonize a particular event or just focus on that one particular crime. Or your commenters like, John Little, who will then go, yeah, I can't vote for the BNP, I find them distasteful. But when you look at what he was saying, particularly back then, when the BNP were around and active, they weren't too dissimilar. And this is something that we have failed as a country, and I think as the left have failed to take real notice of. Because you can't just call someone a racist nowadays. And because now they've taken the attitude of, it's just whatever. To some people, being called a racist now on the internet is considered a badge of honour. So, and it's shocking when I've seen, comment sections of YouTube of literally people pointing out to people, dude, you realise what you're saying is quite racist, and then being explained and having to be told almost why it's racist to say that. It's quite disturbing in a way, and it makes you wonder where this is all going to end up. Now, I think personally where it's going to end up is that sooner or later a actual far right-wing government will take power. I think it's only a matter of time until that actually happens, and when that happens, we might actually see probably a reversal of fortune, because what happened when the BNP and people like this got into power, when they came actually close to getting to power, was when they got exposed. And when they got exposed, that was when they all fell apart. So, will that happen to another party before they claim power? Possibly. However, I think they will actually claim power before, shall we say, the exposing actually starts to happen, and will be massively reflected in their policies and their decisions that they will take as a far-right party. Remember, most of these far-right parties really don't have an answer to a lot of stuff. They just use, populist, nationalistic arguments that really are not answers to the question. They're just deflections in the guise basically draped in a flag. And that's basically all they are at the end of the day.